Long ago, before the first signs of Ragnarök stirred the nine worlds, Baldur, the god of light, beauty, and purity, had met a tragic fate. Deceived by Loki, he was slain by his own brother Höðr with a dart of mistletoe, the only thing capable of harming him. His death plunged the gods into deep mourning, and Frigg, his mother, wept endlessly. Hel, the ruler of the dead, refused to release him, and so Baldur remained trapped in the cold, misty depths of Helheim. But the seers had foretold a day when the world would shake, and the dead would stir from their slumber as the first signs of Ragnarök began. The sun and moon swallowed by wolves, the earth quaking, and the skies torn by fire. The boundaries between realms weakened. In Helheim, Baldur felt it. A shiver in the fabric of the underworld, a calling from beyond. At the heart of Hel's gloomy kingdom, Baldur stood at the edge of Gjall River, gazing at the dark waters that separated the dead from the living. Around him, the restless dead stirred, murmuring prophecies of doom and rebirth. Unlike them, Baldur still glowed faintly, a soft light in the gloom, untouched by death's decay. Then came the moment. Garmr, the blood-stained hound of Hel, howled fiercely at the gates of Helheim. The roots of Yggdrasil groaned and cracked, and the walls of Hel's fortress began to crumble. Hel herself, cold and merciless, realized that her grasp on Baldur was weakening. A path of shimmering mist opened before him, a bridge between death and life. Some say it was the will of fate. Others whispered that it was Frigg's endless prayers and Odin's secret bargains. Whatever the cause, Baldur, with sorrow in his heart and hope in his spirit, crossed the threshold. As he stepped into the world once more, the earth itself seemed to sigh. From the ashen ruins and burning skies, a soft light spread where Baldur walked. The gods who survived the first onslaught of Ragnarök turned their weary eyes to the horizon, where a figure clothed in radiance approached. The son of Odin, the lost god of light, had returned. Yet as Baldur's feet touched the broken soil of Midgard, he sensed the weight of death heavy in the air. Smoke curled into the blood-red sky, and the stench of battle lingered. His once glorious home was shattered, his people scattered or slain. He pressed forward, driven by both duty and sorrow, toward the remnants of Asgard, his memories, of laughter in Valhalla's halls, of gentle songs sung beneath Yggdrasil's boughs, clashed painfully against the silence he now walked through. Each step toward Asgard was a step into the ruins of the old world, and toward those who survived friends, family, allies, and enemies. There, waiting among the broken stones, were the Æsir who had fought in blood, while he had been imprisoned beyond their reach. Baldur's heart pounded with a mix of longing and dread. He knew that reunion would not be simple. Blame hung heavily in the air, and guilt weighed down the gods as much as sorrow. Would they welcome him, the lost son, or see only the ghost of a world that could never return? Still, Baldur pressed onward, the flickering torch of hope in a world nearing its end. Thus began the first steps toward the reconciliation. The path to Asgard was no longer paved with golden light. Its once mighty walls lay broken, shattered stones, scattered like bones across the desolate fields. Valhalla's high towers, once gleaming beacons of strength, now stood charred and crumbling against the ash-darkened sky. Baldur crossed the wreckage, his radiant form a stark contrast to the ruined world around him. Wherever he walked, the ground seemed less burdened, and a faint scent of blooming life followed his steps, brief, fragile reminders of what had been lost. The air itself was heavy, thick with ash, memories, and the bitter taste of defeat. At the heart of the ruins, near the cracked remains of the great well of Urd, he found them. The surviving gods had gathered, battered, bloodied, and worn thin by grief and endless war. Odin was gone, swallowed by Fenrir's hunger. Thor had fallen battling Jormungandr, his hammer striking the beast down only moments before he himself collapsed. Freyr had been consumed in his fight against Surtur's flames, weaponless yet unyielding. Tyr had vanished, lost to the legends whispered in dying tongues. Only a few remained. Vidar, grim and silent, who had avenged his father's death by tearing Fenrir apart with his bare hands. Vali, still youthful, but with battle-hardened eyes. Forseti, the god of justice, scared yet resolute. And among them, sitting in the shadow of a broken pillar, was Höðr, the blind god of darkness, the unwitting slayer of Baldur. Höðr sat with his head bowed, his form trembling, his hands clenching the dust of broken Asgard, as if trying to hold together a world already lost. Baldur's heart twisted at the sight of him. He remembered a different time. 2 young gods, laughing beneath Yggdrasil's green boughs, racing across the rainbow bridge of Bifrost. Höðr, always straining to follow Baldur's voice, always trusting, always smiling. And now, Höðr could barely lift his head. The others looked on, their faces tense, unsure if this meeting would bring forgiveness or blood. Baldur approached slowly. His light, though radiant, dimmed itself out of reverence for the shattered hearts gathered here. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, Baldur spoke. "Brother, do you not know? I have never blamed you." Höðr flinched, as if the words were blows. Tears, long denied, sprang to his sightless eyes and ran freely down his pale face. Höðr choked out. "I would have taken my own life 1,000 times over to undo it. It was not my will." "It was Loki's hand," Baldur said, his voice steady and kind. "And Loki's lies. You were but a pawn, as were we all." Höðr reached blindly forward and found Baldur's hand warm and forgiving. They clasped wrists, the ancient sign of brotherhood and trust, and the earth itself seemed to tremble in recognition. Around them, the other gods slowly stepped forward. Vidar, whose heart had grown hard as stone through grief, bowed his head in solemn respect. Vali gave a faint, hopeful nod. Forseti placed his hand over his heart, silently pledging loyalty anew. Together, they knelt in a broken circle around Baldur. Not as kings or lords, but as survivors. As brothers and sisters bound not just by fate, but by forgiveness. Baldur knelt too, lowering himself into the dust and blood of their broken world. "There is no Asgard left to rule," he said. "There is only the future we choose to build, together." For a moment, silence held them, as sacred as any ancient ritual. And then, like a gust of clean wind breaking through the ashes, came the first sense of peace any of them had felt since Ragnarök began. But even as the gods reconciled, their hearts were not wholly at rest. In the deep shadows beyond the ruin, they could feel it. Loki was not yet defeated. The trickster, the betrayer, had woven chaos into every fiber of the coming end. His presence lingered like a poisonous mist over the 9 worlds. Baldur's eyes hardened as he gazed into the distance. "There will be time for mourning later," he said, rising to his full height. "Now we must finish what was begun." The surviving gods, hearts steeled and spirits renewed, rose with him. They would face the final battle, not out of pride or glory, but out of love for what still might be saved. Thus, from the ashes of loss, the gods prepared to take their stand once more. The great battle awaited. And Loki's lies. "You were but a pawn, as were we all." Höðr reached blindly forward and found Baldur's hand warm and forgiving. They clasped wrists, the ancient sign of brotherhood and trust, and the earth itself seemed to tremble in recognition. Around them, the other gods slowly stepped forward. Vidar, whose heart had grown hard as stone through grief, bowed his head in solemn respect. Vali gave a faint, hopeful nod. For Seti placed his hand over his heart, silently pledging loyalty anew. Together they knelt in a broken circle around Baldur, not as kings or lords, but as survivors, as brothers and sisters bound not just by fate, but by forgiveness. Baldur knelt too, lowering himself into the dust and blood of their broken world. "There is no Asgard left to rule," he said. "There is only the future we choose to build, together." For a moment, silence held them, as sacred as any ancient ritual. And then, like a gust of clean wind breaking through the ashes, came the first sense of peace any of them had felt since Ragnarök began. But even as the gods reconciled, their hearts were not wholly at rest. In the deep shadows beyond the ruin, they could feel it. Loki was not yet defeated. The trickster, the betrayer, had woven chaos into every fiber of the coming end. His presence lingered like a poisonous mist over the 9 worlds. Baldur's eyes hardened as he gazed into the distance. "There will be time for mourning later," he said, rising to his full height. "Now we must finish what was begun." The surviving gods, hearts steeled and spirits renewed, rose with him. They would face the final battle not out of pride or glory, but out of love for what still might be saved. Thus, from the ashes of loss, the gods prepared to take their stand once more. The great battle awaited. With a final steadying breath, Baldur stepped forward, his radiant form parting the swirling mists like a new dawn. His feet touched the broken soil of Midgard, where the fields once green were now scorched and blackened. The air was thick with smoke, and the cries of battle rang distant yet urgent across the horizon. Around him, the remnants of ancient forests burned with a ghostly flame. Shadows of gods and monsters clashed at the edges of his vision, the early battles of Ragnarök already underway. Great serpents slithered across the ruined lands, and the sky was torn by the wings of monstrous beasts. Yet, as Baldur advanced, a hush seemed to follow him, not of fear, but of awe. His presence was a beacon of what once was pure and unbroken. Warriors and spirits alike, even in the midst of their fury, turned briefly to witness the shining god walking among the ruins. Each step he took was heavy with purpose. He was not here to conquer, nor to destroy. He was here to restore. His heart, once filled with sorrow, now beat with fierce determination. Far ahead on the distant battlefield, the forces of chaos gathered like a great storm. Loki's laughter echoed through the torn skies, and the ground trembled beneath the march of giants. Baldur tightened his grip on the light that swirled around his hands, not a weapon, but a force of healing and resolve. He pressed onward into the growing tempest, his return marking the first true counterstroke against the inevitable darkness. The air grew colder as Baldur led the last gods from the ruins of Asgard. They marched across the blackened plains, where Yggdrasil's broken roots sprawled across the ground like the veins of a dying world. Above them, the sky was a twisted tapestry, burning red in one direction where Surtur's flames still raged, deep and endless black in another where the void threatened to devour what little remained. But in the center of it all stood a final battlefield, Vigrid Plain, the destined place where the end would either be completed or undone. It was there that Loki waited. The trickster stood at the head of a grim host, the remnants of the fire giants still burning, the monstrous spawn of hell, clawing and shrieking. Twisted souls from the underworld, risen to serve chaos once more. And beside him, towering above them all, loomed Surtur, the fire giant whose sword gleamed with the heat of worlds undone. It was Surtur who would burn the heavens. It was Loki who would ensure there would be nothing left to rebuild. Baldur paused at the crest of a hill overlooking the plain. The sight before him was nightmarish. Endless ranks of shadowed figures, banners of ash, weapons of bone and flame. The earth groaned under their weight. The sun, though it had barely risen since Ragnarök began, seemed to recoil behind black clouds. The gods gathered around Baldur. Víðarr, silent and iron-willed, tightened the straps of his heavy boots, the same boots that had crushed Fenrir's jaw. Vali, his youth burned away by suffering, notched an arrow to his bow. Forseti gripped his sword of justice, its blade flickering with the last honest light of Asgard, and Höðr, blind yet resolute, stood at Baldur's side, a simple staff in his hand, a weapon of trust and spirit, not deceit. Baldur turned to them, his voice steady but fierce. "This is not for glory," he said. "This is not for vengeance." He raised his arm toward the shattered sky. "This is for memory, for hope, for the chance that something, anything, may grow from the ruin we leave behind." The gods answered with a grim shout, their voices ragged but strong. Together they descended into the battlefield. The battle begins, the clash was apocalyptic. Fire met steel. Bone splintered. Blood soaked the ground that had already tasted too much death. Víðarr struck down fire giant after fire giant, his silent fury unmatched. Vali's arrows flew with deadly precision, felling beasts twice his size. Forseti cleaved through the risen dead, each swing a final judgment. Höðr fought beside Baldur, moving as if he could see the very threads of fate themselves, sensing attacks before they struck, striking back with uncanny force. And Baldur moved like the sun itself had taken human form. Wherever he strode, darkness recoiled. Wherever he struck, the enemy faltered. He was light. He was life. He was all that stood against the void. From across the field, Loki watched with narrowed eyes. Gone was the laughing trickster of old. Here stood a figure twisted by spite, his form shimmering between beauty and horror. A crown of broken ice and burning feathers adorned his brow. In one hand he held a blade made of pure betrayal, forged from all the lies he had ever spoken. Their eyes met across the battlefield. For a moment, all else seemed to fall away, the clashing armies, the screams, the fire and thunder. Only Baldur and Loki remained, two sons of Asgard, two brothers of fate, two ends of a story long in the making. Loki smiled, a thin, cruel smile. "Come, Golden One," he whispered into the void. "Come and see the end I promised you." And Baldur, his heart burning with sorrow and defiance, charged forward through the fray. Toward the final reckoning, the battlefield roared and wept around them, but Baldur saw only Loki. He moved through fire and ruin like a comet through storm clouds, each step scattering the lesser beasts before him. Víðarr, Vali, Forseti, and Höðr fought to clear a path, shielding Baldur's charge, but even they could not follow him into the heart of fate. This was a path Baldur had to walk alone. Loki stood atop a broken stone dais, half ruined by Surtr's fire, half frozen by Hel's breath. He wore a cloak of shifting shadows, and his hands dripped with magic so venomous the very ground hissed where it touched. His eyes gleamed with manic triumph, and something deeper, something more bitter. "Welcome, Bright One," Loki said mockingly, his voice echoing over the field. "Come to save the pieces of a world that's already dead." Baldur said nothing. He stepped onto the dais, the light of his presence pushing back the shadows that clung to Loki like second skin. For a moment, neither moved. The ghosts of the fallen seemed to pause in their weeping. The ruins themselves seemed to hold their breath. Baldur's voice, when it came, was quiet, but it rang out with the weight of the cosmos. "It did not have to be this way, Loki." Loki laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Didn't it?" he sneered. "You were always their favorite, their golden child. I was the shadow in your light, the flaw in their perfect world. He raised his blade of betrayal. It shimmered with every hurtful word ever spoken, every trust ever broken. You should thank me, Loki hissed. Without me, you would have lived forever, smiling blindly in a world built on lies. Baldur's eyes shone not with anger, but with sorrow. I would rather have lived in ignorance, he said, than see what you have become. Without another word, they clashed. Loki struck first, fast and wild, the blade of betrayal seeking Baldur's heart. But Baldur was faster. He sidestepped with the grace of the morning breeze his own blade, a simple sword of Asgardian steel, meeting Loki's weapon with a clash like thunder splitting the heavens. They moved like ancient forces, light against shadow, sorrow against spite. Loki's attacks were fueled by centuries of rage, each strike laced with bitter magic, memories of mockery, slights real and imagined, betrayals he had endured and inflicted. Baldur's defense was calm, resolute, not denying Loki's pain, but refusing to be consumed by it. You were our brother, Baldur said between blows. You were loved. Lies. Loki roared, his next strike forcing Baldur to his knee. I was tolerated. I was used. Baldur rose, knocking Loki back with a surge of shining force. No, Loki. It was you who turned away. It was you who chose hatred. The words struck deeper than any blade. For a heartbeat, Loki faltered. His form shimmered between monstrous and beautiful, vengeful and broken. In that instant, Baldur could have ended it. He could have driven his sword through Loki's heart and ended the suffering. But he hesitated. Because somewhere, deep within the ruin that Loki had become, Baldur still saw the boy who once laughed under Yggdrasil's branches, the brother who had once shared dreams of shaping the stars. Loki saw the hesitation and pounced. With a scream of rage and grief, he drove his dagger toward Baldur's heart. But Höðr, sensing the mortal danger, stumbled blindly onto the dais, and it was Höðr who took the blow. The dagger buried itself in his chest. Baldur caught his brother as he fell, the light in his own body flickering with sudden shock. Höðr's blind eyes, wide with surprise, turned toward Baldur. And he smiled. Forgive him, Höðr whispered. Forgive. Us all. Then he was still. Baldur laid Höðr's body gently on the stone. He rose slowly, his sword falling from his hand. Loki staggered back, breathing hard, the dagger slipping from his grasp as horror dawned in his twisted features. He whispered. I didn't mean. But Baldur's face was beyond anger, beyond sorrow. He was radiant, not with wrath, but with the terrible, beautiful inevitability of light dispelling darkness. You have chosen your fate, Loki, Baldur said quietly. As have I, Baldur stepped forward. Loki tried to summon more magic, tried to flee, but Baldur's hand closed around him, not in violence, but in finality. And as Baldur's light engulfed them both, Loki screamed, a scream not of pain, but of bitter regret, as the magic of betrayal unraveled. There on the broken dais, Loki's body dissolved into mist and ash. Only the whisper of what he once had been remained. The battlefield grew silent. The surviving gods and beasts alike turned their eyes toward Baldur, standing alone in the ruin, carrying both victory and unbearable loss. The battle was over. But the cost had been far greater than any of them had dreamed. Ragnarök had consumed the 9 realms, reducing them to ash and silence. The blood of gods and giants had soaked into the soil, and the once mighty halls of Asgard now lay in ruins. But in the midst of the devastation, life stirred once again. Baldur stood among the remnants, his golden hair tousled by the wind, his heart heavy with sorrow, yet also filled with a strange resolve. He had witnessed the end, the destruction of gods, of families, of entire worlds. His own death had been the catalyst, the first spark that set the wheel of fate in motion. But now, as the remnants of his own existence flickered like the last rays of twilight, he felt something stir within him. Hope. He could feel the presence of the others. Víðarr, Vali, Magni, Modi, Forseti, Lif and Lifthrazr, those who had survived the storm of Ragnarök. They too walked through the wreckage, each carrying the weight of the world in different ways. Baldur climbed what was left of the Bifrost Bridge. The once shining path between the realms was now nothing more than a broken arch, shattered by the cataclysmic battle that had torn through the heavens. His boots clicked against the cracked remnants, the echoes reverberating into the vast emptiness. It was here, amidst the ruins of the god's domain, that Baldur raised his voice, not in triumph, but in a quiet call to those who yet remained. "Come forth, all who yet live," he spoke, his voice steady and full of compassion. "Let us rebuild, not as masters of the old ways, but as stewards of the new world. Let us honor the fallen by choosing to live for something greater than ourselves." From the shadows and the ruins, the survivors slowly gathered around him. Víðarr, covered in the blood of Fenrir, stepped forward first, his face grim but resolute. His gaze met Baldur's, and for a long moment there was only the unspoken bond between them, the bond of those who had walked through the flames together and come out the other side, scared but unbroken. Beside Víðarr, Vali moved with the quiet determination of someone who had witnessed the death of his father, Odin, and yet had endured. His eyes were hollow, but his strength was evident as he took his place among the survivors. Magni and Modi, Thor's sons, stood together, their faces a mixture of youthful confusion and the heavy burden of inheritance. Mjolnir, their father's hammer, still crackled with the raw power of thunder, but it no longer held the same weight of dominance. They were no longer children of a god of battle. They were children of a world that needed peace. The survivors knelt before Baldur, not as subjects, but as equals, bound together by a shared promise, to rebuild, not as conquerors, but as guardians of the new world. Baldur spoke again, his voice carrying across the broken realms. "We swear, by the bones of the old world and the dreams of the new, that we shall build a realm not upon pride, nor vengeance, nor fear, but upon memory, mercy, and the courage to change." The words hung in the air, and as they did, something deep within the earth seemed to respond. The once barren ground trembled, and the air grew warmer. The rivers, once poisoned by the blood of gods and beasts, began to clear. The winds carried the scent of fresh earth, and the sky, though still clouded, began to show signs of blue. Baldur stepped forward, leading the survivors toward the heart of the fallen Asgard. He walked through the shattered halls, each step a quiet defiance against the chaos that had destroyed it. There, among the wreckage of the Golden City, Baldur began the task of healing. He didn't try to rebuild Asgard to its former glory. That age had passed. Instead, he envisioned a new Asgard, one where the gods were not separate from mortals, but worked side by side with them. He envisioned a realm where the wounds of the past could be healed, where peace was not an illusion, but a reality forged from the ashes. Magni and Modi, though young, felt the weight of their father's legacy heavy on their shoulders. Together, they set out to rebuild the city's walls, but this time they did so not as conquerors, but as protectors. They spoke often of their father's strength, but also of his failings, the battles fought in haste, the bridges burned in fury. They vowed not to make the same mistakes. Víðarr, the quiet son of Odin, worked to restore the ancient trees of Yggdrasil. Though the great tree had been felled during the battle, its roots still pulsed with life beneath the surface. He tended to them with care, guiding the world tree's rebirth. He understood, better than most, that the world's healing would take time. But even in silence, he found purpose. Meanwhile, Veli, carrying the weight of the fallen Odin's wisdom, journeyed through the realms. His purpose was not to conquer, but to connect. He sought out the survivors of Midgard, the few who had hidden from the ravages of Ragnarök, and brought them to Asgard. He sought to unite the scattered remnants of mankind with the gods, forging alliances where there had once been division. In Midgard, Lif and Lifrazir emerged from their shelter, their faces pale but filled with the light of survival. Together, they worked to heal the land, planting seeds in the fertile soil, where once there had been only destruction. They knew that the survival of humanity depended on them. They were the new Adam and Eve, carrying the legacy of their people forward. As Baldur traveled through the realms, he encountered those who had once been enemies. The Jotnar, whose hatred for the gods had fueled centuries of conflict, now found themselves standing side by side with the gods they had once tried to destroy. Among them, some remembered the old ways and old wounds, but others, shaped by the fires of Ragnarök, found new purpose. In the end, it was not the strength of their arms that bound them together, but the shared understanding of loss and the desire for something better. One day, as Baldur stood at the edge of the new world, looking out over the waters of the great sea, he saw something new. It was not a sign of power or domination, but a glimmer of unity, a glimmer of hope. The survivors, gods, mortals, and even giants, gathered together, working not as rulers and subjects, but as equals, each with a role to play in the creation of this new world. And so the old world was buried, but from its ashes a new world emerged. A world where Baldur, the god who had fallen, now stood eternal, not as a god of vengeance, but as the heart of a world reborn. He did not need to rule with an iron fist or with a crown upon his brow. His reign was in the lives he touched, in the hope he inspired, and in the promise that though they had lost everything, they still had the strength to rebuild. The days that followed were long and fraught with challenges, but with each passing year, the 9 realms healed. And as the sun set on the horizon, Baldur knew that he had kept the promise he had made at the dawn of the new world, that they would rebuild not as gods and mortals, but as stewards of a world reborn, a world where the past was not forgotten, but was used to shape a brighter future. And so, as the light of the new sun bathed the land, Baldur stood at the forefront, his heart heavy but full of hope. The world had burned, but now it had been reborn, by those who had survived, by those who had learned the lessons of the past, and by the light of one God who had chosen to live for something greater than himself.